Hi all, I have another amazing and historically important game to show you today. Leela chess playing against the mighty Fire chess engine. So this is a top 5 ranked chess engine in the world, and this is in the TCEC Cup round 3. So Leela had managed to eventually beat Ethereal, and Fire is around the same rating, another very, very tough cookie, so to speak. And the match was going on and on. Let's have a look at this round. So knight f3 was the opening, the reti, with these 4 plies. So symmetrical knight situation. Okay, so interesting opening. We have d4, d5, bishop f4, e6. Now, if black wanted to do something about knight b5, which hits c7, then black could have, for example, done bishop c8 here, bishop g4, pardon me, to be able to play rook c8. So after knight b5, to be able to play rook c8, and that doesn't let an imbalance happen like in the game. So it's quite interesting that that Fire allowed this knight b5 to happen now. So knight e6 was played, knight b5, bishop d6. Actually, curiously, we've seen that in a recent game of Magnus Carlsen. Magnus actually snapped off a dark square bishop early on in one of the games we've covered recently. Anyway, so this, is it of great significance to get the bishop pair here? And also, you could argue these pawns are quite good in the centre. They're covering quite a few central squares. That d6 pawn in particular, it's covering up. And also, of course, there's a dynamic c-file, perhaps. There's a bit of dynamism to be gained from this. So swings and roundabouts. e3, we have knight e4. Black plays very aggressively now with knight e4. Especially, okay, after bishop d3, let's say black could have played normally with castling kingside, and we would have what seems to be a reasonable position for both sides. For example, this might be a continuation with an even position. But in the game, we get a violent start to the game with g5, forcing, and now h5. So threatening to trap the bishop now with h4. So Leela actually has to compromise her pawn structure, h4. And we have multiple imbalances to talk about now after knight takes, f takes, g4. What on earth is happening here? It seems symmetrically white has this f file, black has that c file. White has double pawns here, black has double pawns more centrally. The knight goes to g1. Yeah, on g5 it looks as though it's potentially more easy to trap it later with something like f6 at some point. We see queen b6, knight e2. The knight likes f4 anyway here. And note this pawn is offered. So is Fire going to have the same fate as the previous engine opponent, Ethereal, which took a poisoned pawn on b2? Well, in fact, Fire avoids taking on b2 with e5. It's interesting, queen takes b2. You might want to have a look at the pinned comment of this video, why this is an interesting gambit. For example, say castles f5. You might think there's no problem here, but actually have a look at this. Giving up this pawn, c4, and the pressure's on black here. Because bishop d7 is starting to be ruled out because of rook b1 and rook takes b7. So say this continuation, it gets a bit dangerous for black. Yeah, there's compensation here. This scenario, if we take it a bit further, and there's a pawn hanging on e3 as well. But if we take this further, it just seems as though black has a big problem with king safety. For example, this is a fictional continuation where black would have to give up the queen. But there are lots of variations, clearly. I mean, this is, if we look at castles here, I'll give you another example, queen d2, and the vacuum of weaknesses is celebrated here with e4 here, getting into g5 is terminal, for example, like that. A more stubborn approach, d takes, check, queen takes. Yeah, this is just showing how dangerous this gambit is. There's things like this. Yeah, these are fictional continuations. So it seems there are some dangers of this gambit. So quite phenomenal calculation from both sides. Maybe prefer not to accept this, especially. So e5 instead seems logical, liberates the bishop, puts pressure on d4, seems logical. We have a4, bishop e6, and white castles, black castles, queenside, so even more imbalances in the position to talk about here. Yeah, this is really interesting. Queen d2. We have now queen a5. Yeah, there's a lot of stuff going on in this position. So queen a5, seemingly wanting the exchange of queens. Leela rejects that, and the queen goes back to c7, b4. It's like, in a way, this looks like quite an ideal position. White's gaining space and can establish dangerous pawns, and then later, basically, either a6 or b6 might be effective, depending on the exact configuration around the board. King b8. For the moment, king h2. Any b5, one might think actually this is tempting, but one has to be factoring in knight a5. Sometimes getting this c4 square could be handy. For example, a rook coming to c8, that c4 square could be strategically important. Sometimes it's important to consider that. And Leela keeps the tension of these pawns just on a4 and b4 for the moment. We have king h2 tucking the king away rather safely, it seems. Rook hf8, rook f6, knight e7. And now a5. Now that knight's gone from c6, it seems as though Leela is keen to try and maybe get both pawns very aggressively to a5 and b5. Knight g8, kicking the rook. The rook goes back. f5. In some ways it looks impressive, but in another way there's a bit of sadness around black's position actually. It seems because of the double pawns here, the idea of playing for f4 seems out of the question here. White's got a very strong seal on the f4 break, black's potential f4 break, which might have worried white's king safety. It seems white's king is pretty safe here, whilst black on the other hand now after b5 has to worry about a6 and b6 all the time. We have queen g7, rook ac1, as if c4 now might be a concern. That's kind of prevented, it seems. Bishop b1. We have queen e7, queen a2, queen f6, queen a3. So putting pressure with that queen now on d6. It's an interesting square for the queen. Rook fd8. And now bishop a2, putting pressure on d5. So what is actually going on here? There's also pressure on f5, and there might be a break e4 or c4 as well to factor in. We have knight e7. And now queen b4. Slightly mysterious. Why queen b4? Yes, it's interesting. Maybe in some respects there's potential for supporting c4 with queen b4. Maybe. We have queen f7, which does seem to suppress even further actually any c4 intention. King g1. That's a waiting move, and black replies with a waiting move. Pistols at dawn. Spaghetti western. What is going on here? Is this not in total balance? We have rook ce1, queen g7, king h1, knight g8, bishop b1, and that f5 pawn is now protected with the knight. Fine, it's in balance, isn't it? Bishop a2, knight g8. This doesn't seem to be going anywhere, this game. Is it? Rook f2, king b8, bishop c2, king a8. Now things get very strange. There's a very strange turn in this position. One of black's, well, black has two threats sometimes to consider. Rook c4 hits the queen, and queen h6 hits e3. Now Leela starts to play in a fairly mysterious manner here, because it looks as though, shouldn't the rook be around? Something should be around to be able to protect against queen h6, you might think. This is a bit of a vulnerable pawn, because actually these pawns lock down e4 as well, so there's no running away with this pawn. So queen h6 surely needs to be factored in, but we see this move rook b1 here, and it looks already, hold on a sec, why isn't queen h6 possible here, hitting e3? Black actually played rook d7. On queen h6, it seems as though this is not possible actually here, because if d takes e5, and actually you'll note that pinned pawn on d6, so e7 is loose. Okay, so it's not possible, but after rook d7, hasn't black actually renewed the idea that queen h6 hits e3, and given that there's no d takes e5, because the queen is no longer hitting e7, because the rook's protecting e7, queen h6 has been renewed as a threat, has it not? Well, that's the interesting question, because now the rook is itself, the rook, unfortunately, well, it seems that this rook is also a liability on d7, as Leela tries to demonstrate with bishop a4, saying, okay, come and grab my e3 pawn, but I'm going to get b6 in. And is that worth the e3 pawn here to be able to play b6? It is a kind of form pawn, a classic form pawn's a6 like goal hanging, but this is also a goal hanging pawn. And if you remember, the pawn structure with a pawn on b6 won one of the key games against Ethereal as well. So is this something classical AB engines might underestimate, a form pawn on b6? The lure of the e3 pawn is not resisted here. We have queen h6. So what's going on here? Is this in broad daylight, this pawn is being offered here, or is there b6? Well, actually, b6 wasn't played here. We have actually the move rook e1. Yeah, rook e1. And black clearly wasn't worried about b6. Just takes on e3, actually does take that pawn. If we consider this position, if king b8, then b6, for example here, it looks dangerous, for example here, a6, and the two pawns are like carving black's king up here, say b7 check, rather easily. Let's say queen f6 instead. So instead of taking on e3, this position actually has a fascination to it, which I've noticed, believe it or not, that, well, one fascination is knight c1 is powerful to get the f4 square with a positional advantage. Actually, there's a deeper fascination earlier, which I have to show you. Sorry, let me rewind to earlier. Bishop a4. So black played queen h6. Now, if black had played rook here, getting out of b6. Now, this is a fascinating scenario, this one, with the rook getting out of the way in advance. Because, say we have this scenario of a6 form pawn established, it seems as though, rather spectacularly, the goal-hanging pawn can actually be celebrated in this variation in spectacular manner. First taking on e5, playing e4, so that kind of prompts this. Rook takes f5 to be able to play queen takes e4 check. So say here, queen takes e4 check, and mating. Yeah, it's if we look at this position, it's pretty crushing. And also, just for the record here, if rook c6, then rook takes f5, trying to drag the queen away from c6. And here it's just crushing. But also, of note here, in this position, if rook f d8 instead, then there's tactics like this: rook takes, and knight d1 to d3 is strong. If bishop g6, then e takes, rook takes, and then this is strong with the idea of bishop, not just bishop d5. Sorry, there's even a stronger idea, not bishop takes d5 immediately. But let's follow this through with queen d8. Rook takes e5 is strong here for white. White's got two pieces for a rook there. But also on queen takes f5, then queen d6 threatens bishop d5 with terminal effects. The form pawn is covering a lot of escape squares, and the bishop's going to be the executioner in this position. So, for example, here taking it's like totally hopeless. This position, you can't defend it. You know, here we're just going to execute black. So yeah, there's a lot of variations where if that rook stepped back, it's interesting, intricate disasters with a6 stuff going on. It's fascinating. But anyway, let's go back to the game. Queen h6, rook e1. So the rook's not stepped back. The pawn's being offered. What is going on here? The board's on fire, so to speak. Shirov would be proud. Fire on board. Queen takes e3. Is played. That pawn is gulped. Is it a poison pawn of sorts, of any sort? If it wasn't, king b8, then b6 here is, yeah, I think we've mentioned this, is crashing through. So let's go back. Queen takes e3. The rook just steps back casually. So now there's a threat of knight f4, for example. That's dangerous because it's hitting the queen as well as the bishop. So the queen steps out. So just munch the pawn there. What can possibly be wrong with this? Because it seems as though in this position, b6 is ineffectual right now. So has Leela just given up a pawn for nothing? Because if b6, knight c6, hitting the queen, it's pointless to take on c6. This is even position. The pawns are not really doing anything. And if queen a3, black seals up with a6 watertight. So white's not got much there, if anything. So we have queen a3 in advance, though, with b6 as the idea, without knight c6 gaining a tempo. So a key, subtle little attacking move for b6. And the tension of these pawns is great. You know, black's always got to calculate those, but it seems b6 is the strong one to factor in right now. And in fact, it's b6 which is chosen because it hits that rook for a start. Okay, so black seems to have got into hot water. Frame hands on fire. So a6 just offering the exchange. So why? Well, if the rook stepped back, let's have a look at the rook stepping back. It looks as though this is just really dangerous. In general, this position, it does seem extremely dangerous with things like a6 on the cards. So yeah, the rook just stood there. Leela didn't even take the rook. She played d takes e5. Taking the rook, taking the exchange is actually, it's going to be reasonable. Even if black's pawns get undoubled, this position is dangerous because we've got a crossfire on e7 here. Pardon me. Let's use a red arrow. We've got a crossfire on e7. And this position, white's got a nice advantage. But yeah, Leela's not too greedy, it seems, for that. So d takes, and actually knight d4 here. Very interesting. Now, if e takes d4, then bishop takes, and then queen takes e7. Thanks very much. Massive material advantage. So e4. And it's here Leela actually takes the exchange. So the exchange up, plus dot squares are weak. in black's position now, and in fact Leela starts infiltrating on dot squares rather rapidly. Yeah, this seems very unpleasant now for black. The exchange down and this infiltration, this looks like a torture rack of sorts. Yeah, with that knight on d4 controlling lots of squares, all of black's pawns unfortunately on the same colour as the bishop here, hemmed in by its own bishop. f4 under lock and key. Look at the magnificence of this strategically. It's a real torture for black. Knight e7, rook cd1, rook c4. So at the moment, I mean, white is a pawn down, but is the exchange up? So what happens here? Let's have a look. The knight reroutes. The queen stays in the center for a bit. Now c4, yeah, powerful c4. It's breaking up the black pawns. Queen b4, nasty pin on e7. That nasty pin on e7, just, it's a delight. This bishop in particular is just hemmed in by its own pawns. That f4 square is just juicy. Queen d6, wanting the exchange of queens. And yeah, the might of this pawn chain, it looks like this is a really good restrictive pawn chain for black's king as well in all the endgame scenarios. So knight g6, that pawn snapped off. Yeah, black is falling to bits, it seems. Passed pawn there. That a5 pawn is protected. The knight uses the juicy outpost. That looks desperate, e3. And now knight takes, just taking one of white's double pawns for a significant centre pawn. The rook moves there. The rooks are up to no good, trying to crash through to the back row. If black gets greedy, there's horrible things that would happen. Knight e4, the game was ended here by adjudication. One game scenario which might happen, knight g6. It's too dangerous, really, to allow rook d8. So let's say the rook sticks around, then the h pawn is just pushed through, getting even more material. Black would have to sack the knight soon. Yeah, so that would be it. Now, this is a mega complex game. I honestly find it very mysterious indeed. It's like the tension got too much for fire, with the tension of either a6 and b6 to calculate all the time, combined with this mysterious pawn sack on e3. And, you know, in some of the variations, the magnificent fawn pawn on a6 was a winner. Very deep variations there. So fascinating stuff. Maybe this game should be analysed in greater detail at some point, with all the finesses covered more. But I'll tell you what, the pinned comment, if I do any more analysis of the game, it will be in the dynamic analysis, which you can find on Chess World. So check out the pinned comments maybe from time to time. It is something I might update, because the mystery around this game is amazing, I feel. If you enjoyed the game as much as me, then please click the top left box, which should appear shortly, to become a member at chessworld.net and play potentially against other YouTubers if you use that reference code 1053. And you can also check all my analysis in advance from the improved menu, Learn from the Masters. So I'll put all my analysis in advance here for my crib sheets when I do these videos. Okay, comments, questions, likes, shares appreciated. Thanks so much.